So let's talk about serve pronation, what it is, why you want it, and how it's going to help you hit your best serves. Now, this is Taylor Fritz, and he's got a huge serve. And serve pronation simply means that when you are approaching the ball, it looks like you're going to hit the ball with the edge of the racket. In fact, if you saw this frame right here, you'd be like, man, does this guy even play tennis? He's going to hit the ball with the edge of the racket. So his strings are facing at the moment to the left. That's a supinated position. And then he pronates, and when he's done hitting, right after contact, now his strings are facing off to the right. So pronation is the act of having your strings face in one direction, as a right-hander that's facing left prior to contact, and then the racket rotating 180 degrees while you're striking the ball facing the opposite direction. Now, the reason you want to do this is because it's the fastest way to move the racket through contact. What you want to stay away from at this point, where we can see here his racket is like this and his strings are actually facing slightly down, what you want to stay away from is the waiter's tray, where the strings are facing directly up. Because when your strings are facing directly up, you can't pronate, which means you cannot use the fastest way to move the racket through contact. The whole reason we want to use a continental grip, or maybe not the whole reason, but one of the biggest reasons we want to use a continental grip, is it helps us to get the racket on its edge leading up to the ball, which then necessitates pronation. If you use a forehand grip, an Eastern, or worse, a semi-Western grip, no pronation is required, which means you to strike the back of the ball, which means you lose that power source. Now, let's talk very specifically about this pronation. Since his strings prior to contact are facing left, and after contact, the strings are facing right, you can say that there is about 180 degrees of rotation that is occurring that begins prior to hitting to then ending after contact. Now, it's not exactly 180 degrees. It might be a little less. It might be a little more from, the whole progression of the pronation. But it's around 180 degrees. But let's be very specific on how much of the pronation happens prior to hitting and how much of the pronation occurs after hitting. So, let's talk about prior to hitting. Here we can basically see that his racket is facing off to the left. Now, many players think that if it's 180 degrees total, that 90 degrees occurs prior to hitting and 90 degrees occurs after hitting because, it's pretty easy to see that 90 plus 90 equals 180. But that's not what happens. He is hitting the ball out wide. And I want you to watch the direction his racket's traveling. His racket is actually traveling toward this WTA sign on the back fence. So when he's hitting the ball, his strings are facing left. In fact, we can see that where he serves out wide to Kruger, pulls Kruger off the court, and then hits behind him for a simple serve +1 or what's called a 2-1 strategy, hitting behind the opponent. So since his strings are facing left prior to hitting and the ball goes left, we know that at contact, his strings were still facing to the left relative to the path his racket was taking. So that means his racket didn't square up against the ball and changed 90 degrees by the time he contacted. The racket rotated less than 90 degrees by the time he contacted the ball, starting from this on-edge position. So it's something less than 90. So let's say it's 70. So his racket is rotating 70 degrees prior to hitting. And then obviously we got the remainder. So it has to be 110 after he hits, which equals obviously 180. What you want to think of when you're working on pronation is hitting side spin, leading with this edge and cutting the ball, where most of the pronation of the 180 actually occurs after you're hitting the ball. Now, people will then say, well, Ryan, why does it matter? Why does it matter that you pronated if most of the pronation is happening after you hit the ball? Well, it's an easy answer because a body in motion tends to stay in motion. If he did not pronate right now and he stayed supinated, he would hit the frame of the racket against the ball, which is actually a drill that I'll have my students do. I will have them to learn on edge, just hit the frame, and they almost try to send the ball over the fence. So once you start to pronate, the pronation continues, kind of like a follow through on a golf swing. You can't stop at the golf ball, or you shouldn't stop at the golf ball. You just continue. So the pronation continues to happen. But just to understand, more of the pronation is happening after you contact the ball. The reason players feel very inconsistent when they pronate, and I get people telling me this all the time in the comment section, hey Ryan, I'm pronating and I just feel like I'm just rotating the racket and I have no idea where the strings are pointing, is because they typically think that 90 degrees of the rotation happens prior and 90% or 90 degrees, which is 50%, 90 degrees of the rotation happens after. You want to lead with the edge, and then more of the turn is actually happening after contact. Now, I want to show you a simple way to actually improve your ability to pronate, and I'm going to show you this with J.J. Wolf. Now, J.J. is an NCAA champion from Ohio State University, young players just outside the top 100 in the world right now, and this is actually a match against Bautista Agut that I believe JJ, just a few months ago, at the time of this recording, had a few match points in the third set. Very good young player, beautiful service motion. And here's a great view of his strings facing off to the left. And it doesn't matter, by the way, if you're hitting a flat serve, a slice serve, a kick serve, you want pronation on all serves, which means you want to be leading up with the edge of the racket on every serve you hit. Now watch his racket pronate. So here his strings are facing off to his left. Here his strings are facing off to his right. In fact, he has a little bit more than 180 degrees of pronation. That's how loose and flexible he is. But I want you to notice his right elbow, his hitting elbow. Notice how it bends. This is something that I've actually recently tried to incorporate into my serve. I can remember Pete Sampras was very well known for that elbow bend. It actually makes it easier for you to pronate and get your strings to really turn, which again is an easy way to make sure that you're swinging really fast. So if you're struggling with your pronation, if you're struggling having your strings face in one direction and then after contact having them face a different direction, work on after you hit the ball. I know it seems funny, like why does it matter? But it does. Work on after you hit the ball having a bent elbow, because speaking from experience, man, does this make it easier for me to pronate. And it's just an absolutely gorgeous service motion. So this is a different serve slightly than what we saw with Taylor Fritz. He's still swinging off to the right. You can see that after he's hitting the ball, strings, tip of the racket, the tip of the racket is basically facing over here toward this scoreboard. But the toss is a little bit more above his head. He's looking for a little bit more of topspin on this serve. But again, strings facing off to the left, more of the pronation is actually happening after contact. But once you begin pronating, you'll just continue to pronate. But more of the pronation actually happens after you hit the ball. And here's this beautiful elbow bend to make sure that that happens. Here's a great view of Federer. Right there. There's the racket on its edge. Strings are facing to his left. Now here's the interesting thing. After he hits this ball, his strings are going to face this guy on the bench. Watch this. Strings are facing left. And look at the tip of the racket is pointing directly at this guy. I'm not sure who he is, but he's famous right now. If you know who he is, let him know and have him watch this video. The tip of the racket is pointing, the tip of his racket is pointing right at that guy. And notice the rotation of his forearm. The rotation of the racket. Strings are facing left, and now strings are facing right. there's 180 degrees of rotation that is occurring. But this is a T serve that he actually hits an ace against Cameron Norrie. So he doesn't rotate 90 degrees prior to contact, because then he would actually hit the ball at this guy on the bench. So less rotation, less pronation happens prior to contact than after contact. But once he starts rotating, a body in motion just tends to stay in motion. Now, he keeps his arm pretty extended. That's not something that Pete Sampras did. It's not something that you see J.J. Wolf do. And it actually doesn't allow me, I guess, with my flexibility or lack of flexibility, to have as much pronation as I'd like to have. So you can work on having that elbow bend in order to facilitate the proper amount of pronation. Now, if you're looking for people in your local area to play matches against or practice with, or if you want to find a coach who's close to you who can help you with your game, use my link in the description, playyourcourt.com/2minutetennis. When you use my link to sign up, you get 50% off. So please go out and film your serve and work on leading with the edge of the racket if you're someone who is struggling with pronation. When you lead with the edge of the racket, think of still swinging with the edge of the racket leading as you strike the ball, but don't swing towards your target. Swing, if you're right-handed, to the right of your target. If you're a lefty, swing to the left of your target. And then think of the majority of the pronation occurring and the rotation of the forearm occurring after you hit the ball. Otherwise, you're always going to feel like you're inconsistent with the accuracy and dependability of your pronation on your serve. You work on this, there's no doubt you're going to gain confidence, win more matches, and play much better tennis. This is Ryan Reedy from 2minutetennis.net. You got this.